The walls of the courtroom had always felt like a fortress, unshakable, designed to protect its secrets. But that morning, something unexpected happened. The air was thick with anticipation as Pam Bondi, the fierce and relentless attorney, prepared to reveal something that would shake the very foundation of the judicial system. No one saw it coming. No one, except for the few who had been carefully watching. Judge Boasberg was a man known for his strict adherence to the law, his reputation built on years of fair and measured decisions. But beneath the polished exterior, a hidden world had been thriving, a world that Pam Bondi had spent months uncovering. What she held in her hands was more than just a case. It was a bombshell that would explode any image of impartiality Judge Boasberg had carefully constructed. But how far did this corruption go? And could it really be as monumental as it seemed? The details were murky at first, a quiet whisper of an illegal deal, but Pam had always trusted her instincts. They led her to financial records that didn't add up, to off-the-record conversations that now felt like they held the key to everything. The breakthrough came when a whistleblower, one of Boasberg's former colleagues, slipped her an envelope. Inside was a list of transactions, untraceable, payments, large sums of money, and an agreement with a powerful corporate group, a deal that no judge should ever be involved in. Pam's heart raced as she pieced together the information. This wasn't just a conflict of interest. It was something far more dangerous. $1 million deal had passed hands, and Boasberg was at the center of it. But how deep did the corruption run? She walked into the press conference that afternoon with the kind of calm confidence only someone with the truth on their side could possess. The cameras were already rolling, the world watching as she approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pam began, her voice steady, "today we have uncovered a deal that undermines the very core of our justice system." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Judge Boasberg, the man who is entrusted to uphold the law, has been found to have participated in $1 million deal with a private corporation." The room was silent. It wasn't disbelief. It was shock. No one could fathom that such a well-respected figure could be involved in something so vile. The press, usually quick to pounce on scandal, hesitated. Was this really happening? Was this just another baseless accusation? Or was Pam Bondi on the verge of exposing something that would forever change the landscape of American justice? She continued, each word building the tension. This wasn't a simple misstep. This wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. This was premeditated, calculated corruption. Judge Boasberg had the power to influence decisions, to tilt the scales of justice in favor of the highest bidder. Pam glanced at the sea of reporters in front of her, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. And now, the truth is coming to light. The camera flashes were blinding, but Pam didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on the screen, imagining the moment when the public would see the evidence. Would they believe it? Would they stand behind her? She knew that, once revealed, the truth would be undeniable. But how would Boasberg react? Would he come forward and explain himself, or would he bury the truth even deeper? And what would the judicial system do with one of their own being exposed in such a scandal? The room was buzzing with questions, and before Pam could answer, a single figure appeared in the doorway. It was the man himself, Judge Boasberg. He had arrived, and all eyes turned to him as he slowly walked to the front, his face a mask of calm determination. But beneath that calm, Pam could see the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't prepared for this. He had thought the story would stay buried. That was the moment Pam realized. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was a battle for power, for control, and for justice. As Boasberg began to speak, his voice wavered only slightly. "These are false accusations," he said, his tone sharp. "There's no evidence, no proof of any wrongdoing." His words were confident, but they lacked conviction. Pam could feel the walls starting to crack. The moment had come. He was denying. Everything. And Pam knew this wouldn't be over quickly. If anything, it was just beginning. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Boasberg spoke, his denial loud and clear. His words were precise, carefully crafted to deflect any suspicion. But Pam Bondi, standing at the podium, wasn't buying it. She had come prepared for this moment, knowing full well that the man in front of her would not go down without a fight. But Pam had something Boasberg didn't: the truth. "I assure you these accusations are baseless," Boasberg continued, his eyes scanning the room. "There is no evidence to support any claims of corruption. I have been a servant of the law for over 2 decades. This is an attempt to tarnish my reputation." Pam wasn't fazed. She had anticipated this exact response. After all, when a powerful figure like Boasberg is backed into a corner, their first instinct is to deny, to dismiss the allegations as nothing more than a smear campaign. But what Boasberg didn't realize was that Pam had already pieced together a mountain of irrefutable evidence, and she wasn't about to let him wiggle out of this. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "With all due respect, Judge," Pam began, her voice steady and controlled, "the evidence doesn't lie." She gestured toward the large screen behind her, where a series of financial records began to flash on the screen. "This isn't just some vague accusation. This is hard proof of a $1 million deal involving you and a private corporation. Payments made under your name, transactions that trace directly back to your personal accounts." The room was now filled with an audible gasp. The reporters shifted uncomfortably, the weight of what was being presented finally starting to sink in. Boasberg's calm demeanor faltered for a brief second, his eyes narrowing as the documents continued to scroll across the screen. "You cannot deny this, Judge," Pam continued, leaning in, her voice firm. "We have traced the payments, the signed contracts, and the communications that clearly show your involvement in a scheme to manipulate judicial outcomes for profit. And it's all here, black and white." Judge Boasberg was visibly rattled now. He tried to regain control, but it was clear that his carefully constructed defense was crumbling. His usual confidence had begun to slip, his mouth twitching as he searched for a way to explain away the damning evidence. But there was no escape. Every attempt to sidestep the truth only made him appear more guilty in the eyes of those watching. Pammy could see it. The moment when the facade would completely collapse. She pressed on, knowing that this was her opportunity to break him. "The company that paid you," Pam continued, "is directly involved in several high-profile legal cases that you have overseen. You have been in a position of power, making decisions that directly benefited them, and in return, they rewarded you handsomely. This isn't just a case of poor judgment, Judge. This is corruption. And it's all documented." Boasberg's face went pale. He stumbled back, his hands gripping the edge of the podium, as if he were searching for something to steady himself. "You don't understand," he began, but Pam cut him off. "No, Judge, you don't understand," Pam's voice rang out sharp and clear. "You thought you could get away with this because you thought no one was watching. But we've been watching, and now the world will know the truth." The room was buzzing now, the reporters scrambling to capture every moment. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a revelation. The crowd was electrified, sensing the unfolding drama as the truth began to settle in. There was no way back. For Boasberg, his world was falling apart in front of his very eyes. And then, as if on cue, the sound of sirens echoed from outside. It wasn't long before law enforcement officers arrived, their presence only adding to the weight of the moment. The truth had been laid bare, and now it was time for Boasberg to face the consequences. As the officers moved toward the podium, Boasberg stood frozen, his face a mixture of disbelief and fear. He looked around the room as if hoping someone would come to his defense, but there was no one. His empire of deceit had crumbled. The officer reached out, handcuffing Boasberg in front of the world's eyes. His final attempt to maintain his composure was nothing more than a weak, futile gesture. In that moment, the man who once held so Much power was nothing more than a criminal, bound by the very laws he had sworn to uphold. Pam Bondi stood tall, her eyes locked on Boasberg as he was led away. It wasn't about victory. It was about justice. She had taken down a corrupt judge, but more importantly, she had sent a message. No one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. As the cameras flashed and the room filled with murmurs, Pam took a deep breath. She had done what many thought was impossible, and now the nation would bear witness to the consequences of unchecked corruption. Judge Boasberg's empire was over. The weeks that followed Judge Boasberg's arrest were nothing short of a whirlwind. News outlets ran non-stop coverage, dissecting every aspect of the scandal. Pam Bondi had expected a backlash, but she didn't anticipate the sheer magnitude of the fallout that would ensue. Boasberg's arrest wasn't just another political headline, it was a full-scale public reckoning. The integrity of the judicial system, once believed to be inviolable, was now in question. The reverberations were felt far beyond the courtroom as Pam sat in her office, staring at the countless news reports. One thought kept running through her mind. What now? Boasberg's arrest was a victory, but it was just the beginning of something much larger. For every person who saw this as a triumph of justice, there was another who saw it as an attack on the system. And among those who felt the sting of that attack were Boasberg's allies, those who had benefited from his influence for years. On the surface, it looked like the wheels of justice were turning. Boasberg had been removed from his position, and his case was moving swiftly through the legal system. But beneath it all, there was a growing sense of unease. Pam was no stranger to the political games played behind closed doors, but she had never experienced anything quite like this. As more of Boasberg's past decisions were called into question, it became clear that this was not a simple case of a corrupt judge. This was a deeply entrenched web of influence, power, and money. It didn't take long for new revelations to surface. Boasberg's arrest had unearthed a network of connections, deals, and questionable appointments that extended far beyond him. Corporate executives, high-powered lawyers, and even politicians, all were implicated in the fallout. Pam's investigation had uncovered just the tip of the iceberg, and now others were beginning to dig deeper. But the deeper they dug, the more resistance they encountered. Powerful forces had already mobilized, seeking to suppress the story. Before it could go any further, Pam knew that what came next would be the true test of her resolve. She couldn't just expose Boasberg's crimes, she had to see this through. This was no longer just about a single corrupt judge. It was about a system that had allowed corruption to flourish for decades. The media frenzy grew louder. The public's trust in the judicial system was shaken to its core, and with every passing day, more voices began to question how deep the corruption truly went. Pam's every move was being scrutinized. She was hailed as a hero by some, but others, including her critics in the media and within the legal community, were already attempting to discredit her. They called her methods reckless, her motives personal, and the case against Boasberg nothing more than a political stunt. Pam had faced criticism before, but this was different. It wasn't just her reputation on the line, it was the entire integrity of the judicial system. Yet despite the mounting pressure, Pam remained unshaken. Her phone rang constantly from supporters and detractors alike, but she remained focused. Her eyes were on the prize, bringing accountability to the system that had allowed this corruption to go unchecked for so long. She had set her sights on a new target, one even bigger than Boasberg. She knew that in order to truly fix the system, the rot had to be eradicated at its roots. But the political pushback was growing. Powerful figures, some who had been aligned with Boasberg, began to circle the wagons. Pam received anonymous threats. Her every move was being monitored. It was clear that those who had benefited from the corrupt system weren't going to let her take down one of their own without a fight. In an unexpected twist, Pam was approached by a source within the Department of Justice. The informant, a career prosecutor, revealed that the corruption Boasberg had been part of was not isolated. It reached into the very heart of the department, influencing judicial appointments, legal rulings, and even high-profile cases. The prosecutor's message was clear. This was much bigger than anyone realized, and it was only a matter of time before others were implicated. Pam met with the informant in a clandestine location, their conversation filled with urgency. "You have to take this further," the prosecutor warned. "Boasberg was just a small piece of the puzzle. If you can get to the core, you'll have the power to change everything. But be careful. There are people who will stop at nothing to protect their interests." The weight of the task before her was immense. Pam had already been through hell to expose Boasberg's corruption, but now it felt like she was standing at the edge of something much larger, something that could unravel the entire judicial system, if handled correctly. But was she ready to take on such a monumental fight? Could she survive the political and personal attacks that would inevitably come her way? Pam knew one thing for certain. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about exposing a corrupt judge. It was about exposing an entire network of corruption that had been allowed to fester for too long. And she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The arrest of Judge Boasberg had been the beginning of something much bigger, and Pam Bondi was at the center of it all. What was once a simple case of judicial misconduct had turned into a national movement, one that threatened to upend the very foundations of the justice system itself. The pressure on Pam Bondi was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The weight of the investigation, the constant media attention, the powerful forces working against her. It was all reaching a boiling point. But Pam was no stranger to adversity. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, and this was her biggest battle yet. The stakes were higher than ever, and she knew that the path she was walking could lead to irreversible consequences, both for herself and for the very system she was trying to expose. Behind the scenes, the political pushback was becoming more aggressive. Behind every news report was a new set of attacks, targeting Pam's character, her credibility, and her every move. Boasberg's allies, the ones who had been benefiting from the corrupt system, were beginning to rally. It wasn't just about defending one man anymore. It was about defending an entire network of power brokers who had long operated in the shadows. And they weren't going to let Pam tear down their world without a fight. But Pam wasn't backing down. She had never backed down before, and this time was no different. The more they tried to discredit her, the more determined she became. She couldn't let this go. Too much was at stake, not just for her career, but for the future of the American justice system. For the countless people who relied on a fair and impartial court system, Pam knew that if she didn't continue the fight, the corruption would only deepen, and those who had profited from it would continue to control the system unchecked. Her next move was a bold one. She had already exposed Judge Boasberg, but the true extent of the corruption remained hidden, buried within the inner workings of the system. Pam needed leverage, something that would bring down not just Boasberg, but the entire network of corruption he was a part of. And she had just the thing. A high-profile whistleblower who had been on the inside, someone who had first-hand knowledge of the deals, the backdoor dealings, and the payoffs that had been taking place under the radar. This whistleblower was a former associate of Boasberg's, someone who had seen the corrupt practices up close and personal. Pam had been in contact with them for weeks, and now, with the final pieces of the puzzle in place, they were ready to go public. The whistleblower had risked everything to come forward, and Pam knew that this was the turning point. If she could get this individual to testify, to provide irrefutable evidence of the widespread corruption, it would be enough to take down not just Boasberg, but the entire network that had been profiting from the system's flaws. The day of the testimony arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. It was a crucial moment. This was the key to bringing down the corrupt empire, the final step in a journey that had started with a single explosive revelation. Pam sat in the front row, her mind racing as she waited for the whistleblower to take the stand. The courtroom fell silent as the whistleblower walked up to the witness stand. Their face was obscured by a veil of anonymity for their own protection, but their voice was clear and unwavering. "I was part of the system," they began, their words cutting through the silence. "I saw firsthand the deals, the payoffs, and the way the system was rigged from the inside out. Judge Boasberg wasn't the only one involved. There were others, high-ranking officials, politicians, and corporate executives who had a hand in the corruption. It went all the way to the top." Pam's heart raced as the whistleblower's testimony laid bare the depth of the corruption that had been festering within the system for years. The room was filled with shock as the details of illegal financial transactions, secret meetings, and illicit agreements were exposed. It was a full-scale betrayal of the American people, something that, until that moment, had seemed almost too unbelievable to fathom. As the testimony continued, more and more names were dropped. Politicians who had been involved, corporate moguls who had paid for favorable rulings, and judges who had been willing to compromise their integrity for personal gain. It was a web of corruption so vast that it threatened to bring the entire judicial system to its knees. But the most damning revelation of all came when the whistleblower described a secret meeting that had taken place just weeks before Boasberg's arrest. In that meeting, high-ranking officials had discussed ways to cover up the corruption, to bury the evidence, and to protect those involved. It was a last-ditch effort to maintain control over a system that was slipping out of their grasp. Pammy knew this was the moment of truth. She had the evidence. She had the witnesses. And now, with this testimony, she had the smoking gun that could bring down the entire corrupt network. The room was in chaos as the full extent of the conspiracy was revealed, and Pam could feel the weight of the moment settle over her. This was what she had been working toward all along, bringing the truth to light, no matter the cost. The public reaction was immediate. Within hours, the story broke across every major news outlet. People took to social media, calling for widespread reform within the justice system. The pressure on those in power grew to an unbearable level, and soon, even the most influential figures involved in the corruption began to distance themselves from Boasberg and his allies. It was clear that the system was in crisis, and there was no turning back. Pam knew that the battle wasn't over. There were still many obstacles ahead, still many who would try to protect their own interests, but for now, she had achieved a monumental victory. The corrupt judge was behind bars, the network of corruption had been exposed, and the nation was demanding accountability. Pam Bondi had done what many thought was impossible. She had taken down a corrupt empire and put the system on notice that the fight for justice was far from over. The shockwaves from the exposure of Judge Boasberg's corruption reverberated through every corner of the nation. The scandal had unfolded in ways no one could have predicted, pulling back the curtain on a web of deceit that had ensnared not just one man, but an entire system built on secrecy and manipulation. Pam Bondi had become a symbol of accountability, standing as the voice of justice against a system that had long been blinded by power. But as with every victory, the aftermath was never easy. The revelations had ignited a firestorm, one that both galvanized the public and sent shockwaves through the political elite. Boasberg's arrest was just the beginning, but it was clear that the journey Pam had started would not end with the downfall of one judge. It had opened a Pandora's box of corruption that reached deep into the corridors of power. Pam knew that the battle was far from over. There were still many in the shadows who would stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. Pam's phone never stopped ringing. The media flooded her with interview requests, some praising her as a hero, others accusing her of overreaching, of stirring up division and distrust. The political backlash was swift. While many saw her as a champion of justice, others viewed her actions as an attack on the very foundations of the legal system. They painted her as someone who was trying to tear down a system that had worked for years. And as the pressure mounted, Pam began to feel the weight of the consequences of her actions. For weeks, Pam was thrust into the spotlight. The pressure of maintaining public support, continuing her investigations, and facing constant threats from those who wanted to silence her was enough to make anyone question their resolve. Yet, Pam remained determined. She had opened Pandora's box, and there was no turning back. Every new piece of evidence, every new whistleblower, brought her one step closer to fully dismantling the corrupt network that had been operating unchecked for so long. But it wasn't just the political and media scrutiny that weighed on Pam. She felt the emotional toll of what she had uncovered. The more she learned about the network of corruption, about the lives that had been ruined, the cases that had been manipulated, and the lives of ordinary people destroyed for the sake of profit, the more she realized just how deep the rot went. It wasn't just a legal scandal, it was a moral failure of epic proportions. In the days following the whistleblower's testimony, Pam began to meet with reform advocates, experts, and lawmakers, all of whom had their own ideas about how to address the systemic corruption. There was an undeniable momentum, a collective desire to fix what had been broken. But Pam knew that real change would take time, and that the forces resisting reform would be just as powerful as the ones she had already taken down. The fight was far from over. Pam's role as the catalyst for change had made her both a hero and a target. Her every move was now being watched, both by those who sought to protect the old guard and those who demanded progress. She was no longer just a prosecutor. She was the face of a movement, the embodiment of hope for those who believed in a justice system that worked for everyone. One morning, as Pam sat in her office reviewing the latest developments in the case, she received a phone call that would mark the next chapter in her fight for justice. It was a high-ranking senator from the opposition party, someone who had once been a vocal critic of her methods. But now, things had changed. The senator had seen the magnitude of the corruption exposed by Pam's efforts, and he was ready to act. "We need to make sure this never happens again," the senator said, his voice firm. "I've started drafting a bill for judicial reform. We want you to be a part of it. You've shown us the way, and now it's time to fix the system." Pam felt a sense of vindication. For months, she had been pushing for reform, fighting against those who had tried to silence her. Now, it seemed, that her efforts had finally gained traction. The idea of systemic reform was no longer a pipe dream. It was becoming a reality. The first steps toward rebuilding a broken system were being laid, and Pam would be at the forefront of that change. But she knew that this was just the beginning. The reform bill would face fierce opposition, and there were still powerful forces that would try to derail the progress. Pam had become a symbol of resistance, but there were still battles to be fought. It would take time, resources, and the unwavering support of those who believed in the cause. But Pam was ready. She had already brought down a corrupt judge, exposed a network of corruption, and ignited a nationwide conversation about the need for change. Now it was time to take the next step. As Pam stood outside her office, watching the sun set over the city skyline, she reflected on everything she had been through. The road to justice had not been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments when it seemed as if the forces against her were too powerful to overcome. But Pam had persevered. She had fought for what was right, not just for herself, but for the countless people whose lives had been affected by the corruption she had uncovered. And in that moment, Pam Bondi knew one thing for sure. The battle for justice was never truly over. It would be a constant fight. But as long as she had the strength to continue, she would never stop. The system had been shaken to its core, and now it was time to rebuild it, stronger, fairer, and more transparent than ever before. The story of Judge Boasberg's corruption had ended, but Pam's fight for justice had only just begun.